This is Stanley Military Cemetery in Hong Kong. In the fall of 1941, 2,000 Canadian soldiers came here to garrison the colony. It was considered one of the safest and cushiest postings they could get. No one could believe that within 3 weeks, these men would be fighting for their lives. This is the grave of John Baker. He was killed in action at Hong Kong, December 25th, 1941, aged 18. He was one of the first Canadian soldiers to fight and die for king and country.
Hong Kong, a city aimed at the future. But only a few minutes from the skyscrapers and the crowded streets are shattered pillboxes and abandoned tunnels, silent reminders of a desperate past. October 1941. The dark shadow of tyranny has fallen across the world. Everywhere the Axis powers are victorious. In Asia, Japanese armies, in an orgy of looting, rape, and murder, are cutting a path of devastation through China. The empires of Britain and Japan are still at peace, but directly in the path of Japan's relentless march towards the immense wealth of Southeast Asia lies Britain's colony, Hong Kong.
The Japanese have every reason to attack Hong Kong. Britain's far eastern outpost lies athwart the Japanese line of communications to the south. Mr. Churchill, on behalf of us all, has sent a heartening message to Hong Kong, to which the governor replied, "We intend to do our best."
Soon Hong Kong will experience its hour of darkness. When Britain decides to reinforce its Hong Kong garrison, the Canadian government, eager to see its army in action, volunteers 2 battalions: the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada, 2,000 untried troops.
Daddy, let me stay out late, for tomorrow is our wedding day. Can't the baby kind of celebrate, oh, kiss the boys goodbye.
On October 27th, 1941, the 2,000 young men set sail from Vancouver on the steamer Awatea. With the Royal Rifles of Canada is a 22-year-old signalman, William Allister.
It sounded too wonderful to be true. A dream of glory and crazy freedoms, of breathless escapades, laughing in the face of death. You were Douglas Fairbanks Jr., passing through the inferno unscathed. We found ourselves crammed into the bowels of the boat, several flights below deck. 2/3 of the boat were graciously cordoned off for officers only, to keep out the lowlife. We slept in hammocks over our mess tables, 2 pairs of sweaty feet on either side of my face. At last, after 3 long weeks, this interminable voyage, sailing and drinking and dreaming, did draw to a close. The island of Hong Kong came into view. It was the beginning. We entered Hong Kong Harbour on a bright tropical morning, November 1941. The air was throbbing with explosive excitement. Wonderful rib-sailed junks, sampans right out of National Geographic. Kowloon, our first Asian city.
We're in Hong Kong Harbour, and you can actually see Hong Kong off to the left and Kowloon off to the right. On November 16, 1941, the 2,000 Canadians of Sea Force made this exact same trip. During the trip, they had been warned about the Japanese, but whatever their concerns were, they were soon forgotten by the exotic delights of Hong Kong.
The garrison has been reinforced with Canadian troops, here seen arriving. All of them are volunteers since the war began, and all of them are obviously in the highest spirits. After disembarking, they march towards the town on the way to their billets. They must have proved a very heartening sight for the mixed population.
The governor of Hong Kong welcomes the men of Sea Force, led by a veteran officer, Brigadier John Lawson. The 2,000 men go into billets just outside Hong Kong's twin, the mainland city of Kowloon, just 40 kilometers from the encampments of the Japanese army. But to the raw Canadian troops, the Japanese and the threat of war seem far away.
The Canucks were doing the town. MPs braced themselves for a heavy night. Prostitutes were out in force. Beer poured down thirsty gullets, and volleys of uninhibited bellowing, hooting, yelling echoed over the roofs of the colony. 3 short weeks. War so far away, and life a continual party.
While the Canadians revel in the exotic pleasures of Hong Kong, 60,000 battle-hardened Japanese troops move into position facing the colony's border. In the hills above Kowloon City, the British have built an 18-kilometer-long defensive line known as the Gin Drinkers Line. If the Japanese attack, the British estimate the line will be able to hold them off for at least 2 weeks.
These are 2 entrances into the Shingmong Redoubt. You can tell by the name Shaftesbury. This one's Regent, but they were built by Londoners. These positions were built in the 1930s as part of a major defense system called the Gin Drinkers Line. There have been threats of Japanese invasions for a long time, and the British had built these as a precaution. They're in interconnected tunnels running all the way through the mountains, and of course, this was going to be the first line of defense should the Japanese come. There's a great view from the top.
The labyrinth of fortified bunkers and tunnels is designed to be defended by hundreds of men. But in December 1941, it is manned by only 45 British soldiers.
From heights like this one, the British could observe Japanese troop movements. But of course, this was nothing new. There had been a threat of Japanese invasion for more than 4 years, and there really was a sense of complacency throughout the colony. But that would all change on December the 8th, 1941.
December 8th, 1941. Japan attacks throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya. And at the first light, 20,000 Japanese troops surge over the northern frontier of the colony of Hong Kong.
This is one of the tunnels of the Shingmen Redoubt that actually leads right down into the mountain. And this is a ventilation shaft, and as you can see, it's not covered. And in war, this is a disaster. Around midnight on December the 9th, the Japanese infiltrated these positions and then came along, dropping grenades into the ventilation shafts, and then blew holes in the tunnels themselves, jumped in, and drove out the Royal Scots.
Within hours, the Japanese capture the Shingmen Redoubt, shattering the British defense line. Mass panic grips the mainland city of Kowloon. Thousands of people rush the port, desperate to cross to Hong Kong Island. Among the Canadians evacuating their barracks is William Allister.
We got our equipment on 2 trucks and went roaring through the streets, rifles cocked for snipers, people running everywhere. It was bedlam. Looters being shot all around us. One drunken police sergeant was shooting at anyone, looter or not. Good, clean fun. The shore was lined with people with no way to cross. They knew what happened when the Japs took a city.
The loss of Kowloon is a huge blow, leaving Hong Kong isolated more than 1,000 kilometers behind enemy lines. Now, all that lies between the Japanese army and Hong Kong Island is a narrow channel of water and the undermanned British garrison with its 2,000 newly arrived Canadian troops. On December 13th, Japanese troops take control of the city of Kowloon. Now, with the mainland secure, Japanese guns are moved into position to pour fire across the harbour onto the last British stronghold, the island of Hong Kong.
Nippon slings down the gauntlet. The army attacks Hong Kong, the base of Jam Bull's predatory action in East Asia for a century. In accordance with Bushido, Nippon demands surrender, but the British refuse. The siege of Hong Kong begins.
This is Hong Kong Harbour, and you can see across the channel the new territories and Kowloon. After December 13th, the Japanese had total control of this area, and they brought all their artillery forward. And they started a 6-day bombardment on various positions on the Hong Kong island. They managed to set alight the oil storage tanks and a number of factories, and by December 18th, this whole area was shrouded in smoke. They knew an invasion was coming, but they didn't know where and they didn't know when.
Observing the bombardment from the heights overlooking the harbour and taking shelter in a pillbox is signaller William Allister.
The whole area from the harbour straight up to the Wong Ni Chong Gap was devastated with a deadly and incessant shelling. It seemed about to blow our measly little pillboxes to smithereens. We lay on the floor waiting for shells to land. Our pitiful pillbox walls seemed paper thin. We listened to the artillery. Here they come. The first sickening whoosh of air hissing death. Stop. Let me live. With shaking fingers, Demont passed me a cigarette. He forced a sickly smile. Time, he said, goes so fast when you're having fun.
Repairing telephone lines damaged by Japanese shells is Montrealer George Blackie Verreau.
We are all on Hong Kong Island now. We were told that we can hold our position for some 100 days. This darn artillery keeps hammering at us. They're preparing a surprise for us. Only one direct hit to make me a has-been. Just the same, we hang in. The Japs are now half a mile away with only the water separating us.
By December 13th, the Japanese had total control of the mainland, and in fact, this was their front line. The only thing between them and Hong Kong Island, of course, was the channel. The Japanese decided to make an attempt, or a gamble, on the night of December 18th, 1941. And in small boats, they came across the Limong Passage, which is here, only 500 meters wide, and they completely took the Allies by surprise.
Leading thousands of troops in one of the first waves of the Japanese attack is Colonel Teshichi Doi.
It was a spectacular and grim crossing. Time and again the water was lighted as brilliantly as broad daylight by the fire of burning heavy oil in the storage tanks on the opposite shore. Streams of enemy machine gun fire from the opposite shore slowed the boats. The only alternative under the circumstances was for the men reaching the shore on the same assault boat to charge into the immediate enemy and move inland as fast as we could. This, our soldiers did.
One of the frontline Canadian soldiers trying to hold off the massive Japanese assault is a 20-year-old rifleman, Sidney Skelton, of the Royal Rifles of Canada.
Men in khaki jackets, breeches and puttees, helmets bearing the single star, long bayonets, automatic weapons. Some of them threw themselves on the barbed wire while others streamed over the human bridges. We were on the high ground and we really peppered them. My bren was hot, but they kept coming. I thought, Jesus, there's no end to them.
Within hours, in desperate fighting, the Japanese cut through the first lines of defense. The Japanese plan is to seize the hills in the northeast corner of the island, Saiwan Hill, Mount Butler, and Mount Parker, and plunge into the Wong Ni Chong Gap, the narrow valley that divides the island in two.
The success of the Japanese invasion depended on them seizing the heights, here at Saiwan and Mount Parker over there. And this they did very, very quickly. Now, the Allies, to have any chance at all in this battle, had to push them off. And it was during these counterattacks that the 1st Canadians of the Royal Regiment of Canada were killed in action here at Saiwan.
A spirit of madness took over, gobbling up everything: earth, bodies, guns. My friend Tommy Marsh fought desperately in the hills behind our pillboxes, where platoons were being slaughtered. He caught a bullet through his throat and jaw, and was blown up by shell fire.
As the Canadians fight to recapture the hills, the Japanese push inland, heading for the Wong Ni Chong Gap. Coming to the aid of wounded Canadians is a 20-year-old rifleman with the Royal Rifles of Canada, Alf Babin.
When the Japanese first came, that's when I started to drive an ambulance. We had several casualties that needed the attention of the main hospital, so there were 4 of them that they put on stretchers and put it in the ambulance I was driving. I went around a curve and the ambulance was fired upon, and the windshield was shattered. So I decided to check on the people in the vehicle and see how they were. The bullets, when they hit the cab, they slowed down and they ricocheted around the inside of the cab. And one fellow, I guess it went just underneath his nose. He passed on, I guess, because of the excessive bleeding. Because I couldn't do anything at the time. The problem was to get out of there.
The speed of the Japanese advance surprises Hong Kong's high command. It's been only 12 hours since the Japanese invaded the island, and in that short time, they have seized the heights in the northeast of the island and are now poised to capture the Wong Ni Chong Gap and cut the island of Hong Kong in two.
This is Jardine's lookout, one of the critical defensive positions defending Hong Kong Island. After the Japanese landing, the Japanese had come inland so quickly that although this was a secondary position, it was already coming under attack. Up here we have one of the bunkers used to defend the lookout. This one obviously saw a lot of action. You can actually see the bullet holes in this area here. And you can see at the top, for example, how intact this one is, because there's the observation tower, and you can actually see the ventilation shafts in here. They would have been manned by probably 15 to 20 men with machine guns, and these were crucial to stopping the Japanese as they invaded.
As the Japanese swarm up the heights, they quickly overcome the front-line pillboxes and defenses on Mount Butler and Mount Barker. Now, with their communications down and not knowing where the Japanese are, the High Command sends in small groups of soldiers to try to stem the Japanese advance and retake the high ground.
The first 12 hours of the Japanese invasion had gone so well for the Japanese that it had thrown the Allied defenses into total chaos. They really had no idea where the Japanese were, but they knew they were coming fast. So what they decided to do was send A Company, which is about 150 men, of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, including John Osborne, up this direction past this pillbox to push the Japanese off Jardine's lookout and recapture Mount Butler.
Leading A Company in the attack is one of Seaforce's few experienced soldiers, a 42-year-old veteran of World War I and a father of two from Winnipeg, Company Sergeant Major John Osborne. Moving through the jungle with Osborne's company is 19-year-old Private Cliff Matthews.
I saw a Japanese soldier about 150 yards away creeping through the long grass towards us. I shot him. Seconds later, a bullet struck me, entering near my left collarbone and exiting out the back of my shoulder, effectively paralyzing my left arm.
A Company's counterattack took place over here on Jardine's lookout, and they very quickly drove the Japanese off these heights here and advanced down the hill towards Mount Butler over there. When they reached Mount Butler, they were attacked by a large Japanese force, and they were forced to retreat. And as you can see by the terrain, it's very cut and very rough, and they're broken into small groups as they tried to make their way back up to Jardine's lookout. On these little spurs here, they put up a very strong defensive fight, and it was here that Company Sergeant Major John Osborne won his Victoria Cross, over there.
All of a sudden, Japs appeared and an officer started waving his sword at us, implying that we should surrender. Stan Stodge responded by shooting and killing the Japanese officer. A barrage of grenades and mortars followed. Sergeant Major Osborne was about 20 feet away from me. I saw something land near. I dropped to the ground and covered my head. The explosion lifted me right off the ground. When I looked up, Osborne was gone, but the guys farther up the hill said that he had thrown himself on the mortar, probably saving my life.
A Company's counterattack fails, and by dawn on December 19th, the Japanese hold the western slopes of Jardine's lookout, overlooking Wang Ni Chong Gap, the valley that divides the island in two.
This is the Wang Ni Chong Gap. It's really a valley between Mount Nicholson on the west and Jardine's lookout on the east. It was one of the most important strategic positions on the island, and of course it was also a center of the Japanese attack. Unfortunately for John Lawson, it is also where his headquarters were.
Brigadier John Lawson, commander of the Canadians, now heads West Brigade. He and his command bunker lie at the center of the defense of Hong Kong.
This is the West Brigade command bunker, and the man commanding West Brigade was the Canadian officer Brigadier John Lawson. This is also where all their communications would have been, and this is where they would have found out about the Japanese attack. But it didn't take very long before Lawson would find out about it himself, because by 7 o'clock in the morning on December 19th, Japanese bullets were already ricocheting off this bunker, and you can actually see some of the holes here. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Japanese fire had become so severe, and obviously they had so many men on the slopes of Jardine's lookout, that Lawson felt he had to try to make a break for it. At 10 a.m., he sends out his last communique that he's going to fight it out, and he makes a run for it.
Manning a machine gun not far from the bunker is Sergeant Bob Manchester.
I was manning a gun not far away and saw Lawson and 3 others run from the bunker and start up the hill. A Japanese machine gun firing at us suddenly switched over to them. They were shot down like 10 pins, like clay ducks.
Lawson and his staff got about 50 feet from the command bunker when they were caught in a hail of machine gun fire. Half the men, including Lawson, went down right in this position here. In fact, Lawson's body was found right here after the war, and it was exhumed, moved to Saiwan War Cemetery. But the tragedy wasn't only that Lawson was killed, it was that the battle was at its most crucial phase and West Brigade was leaderless.
With Lawson dead and the command bunker captured, coordinated defense in the western half of the island breaks down. Now the men fight desperate, piecemeal actions.
One of the most courageous actions of the Battle of Hong Kong took place over on that tennis court. But in 1941, it wasn't a tennis court, it was the command bunker of the Winnipeg Grenadiers. Throughout December 19th and 20th, the Japanese infiltrated this area and surrounded that position. And the men inside literally fought off counterattack after counterattack and held their position for 4 days, even though they couldn't be reinforced. And it wasn't until they ran out of ammunition and all the men were wounded that they finally surrendered. I consider that to be the most heroic action in the entire battle.
Small units are ordered to attack over Mount Nicholson and to try to relieve the men surrounded by the enemy and trapped in the Wong Ni Chong Gap. Sergeant Ed Shaler of the Winnipeg Grenadiers is with them.
We knew they were in trouble, but what we didn't know was that they'd been virtually wiped out. Grenades were landing all around us, and bullets. The Japanese were sometimes about 50 feet away. One of them came running at me with a sword, waving it in the air, which was a pretty stupid thing to do. The Japanese with the sword didn't get very far. There was no quarter given and none expected. We never did get anywhere near the men in the Wong Ni Chong Gap.
As small, scattered groups of troops plunge into separate fights in the hills, trying to relieve the Wong Ni Chong Gap, dozens are killed and scores taken prisoner.
The counterattacks to relieve the Wong Ni Chong Gap were really a desperate act. And the men who went out there, the Royal Rifles and Hong Kong Volunteers, and really anyone they could find, had no chance of succeeding. The Japanese were too strong. And over the days of December 22nd, 23rd, the Japanese just overwhelmed all these men and either killed them or took them prisoner. And most of them were brought here to Repulse Bay, held in the mansions on top of these cliffs. They were then roped together, taken to the edge of the cliff, and executed, and their bodies were kicked over the side here.
Captured in the fighting above the Wong Ni Chong Gap is Corporal Bud Dix.
When they took us prisoner, I was trying to figure out which I preferred, to be shot or have my head cut off. The officer stood beside us with a sword ready to come down. With that, we threw ourselves over the cliff. They opened up on us from above. In falling, I smashed my face on a rock and lost consciousness. When I woke, I thought I was dead. But I found out, you don't die that easily.
As the counterattacks fail, the Japanese advance continues, and they split the island in two, with some forces heading south towards the Stanley Peninsula, while others swing west towards the city of Victoria. In only 3 weeks, the exotic golden island of Hong Kong, to which the young, fresh-faced Canadians sailed, has become a desperate and chaotic battlefield. Royal Rifle Signalman, Montrealer George Verreau.
Christ, what noise. More bombs. We're trapped like rats. We've been told that the Japs do not take prisoners. I feel sad. I will never see good old Montreal again. Still, it seems so stupid to die this way. The enemy is closing in. The stinking rats got two of my buddies. Sharp, Fairley, Orvet died. All three recently married. 3 more young widows in Canada.
With Hong Kong's defense forces isolated and fighting desperate, scattered actions, the Japanese unleash a reign of terror against civilians. 52-year-old civil servant, Mai Jo-heng.
The Japs began to search our apartment. Then we were ordered to go out the back door into the yard. I was hit. I fell down. I decided to lie still. I lay there all night, pretending I was dead. The next morning, I heard women crying, and I saw over 30 bodies of Chinese who had been murdered lying in the yard. Of the 9 men who had been in my apartment, I was the only survivor.
As the fight continues in the west of the island, the Japanese push south towards Fort Stanley on Stanley Peninsula. On Christmas Day, they reach St. Stephen's Hospital. At the hospital, overflowing with wounded, doctors and nurses wait for the Japanese to arrive. With them is 20-year-old orderly Alfred Babin. More than 60 years later, Alfred Babin returns to St. Stephen's.
Well, there's a lot of confusion. Nobody knows what to do or what to expect. And we were told that the Japanese didn't take prisoners. And they, with rifle butt, they banged on the door. And when it was opened by Colonel Black, he kind of resisted. He didn't want them to come into the hospital. And he explained to them that, or he tried to explain to them that it was strictly a hospital, but they didn't pay any attention. They just shot him. They were very fierce looking, and their voices were, to us, sounded like staccato. It was very sharp and abrupt. And they had us go up the stairs. These 2 rooms, they were absolutely filled with men. And it was so crowded we couldn't sit down. And the temperature had climbed up to well over 100 degrees. And inside it was suffocating. We asked for water. Someone said, "How do you say water in Japanese?" So someone hollered, "misu." So then we started to holler, "misu." And they called to one of the men to come and get misu. So he went out. Then we heard screams and a lot of shouting, and then everything was quiet.
Japanese soldiers continue to rampage through the hospital, torturing, raping, and murdering. Not even the wounded are spared. 20-year-old Sidney Skelton is about to be operated on for machine gun wounds.
I'd been waiting for surgery when the Japs took the hospital, and I had been given some pre-operative anesthetic, and I was pretty groggy. But certain things you never forget. Japs stormed the hospital, throwing grenades and bayoneting the wounded. I rolled under my bed and lay as still as I could. A Jap turned me over and kicked me in the face and tore off my bandages. I didn't move or make a sound. The guy must have thought I was dead and just took off. I heard screams coming from outside. Terrible screams I can still hear in my head.
We found out after we were released what had happened. When they opened the doors and let us out, and of course we had, you know, the bodies of the people who were in their beds and had been killed, and there was one body face down the stairs, had been mutilated, eyeballs taken out, so on, and there was a stench of blood really in the air that was terrible, sweet, sickening. About 100 feet from the hospital, we built a huge fire, and then we were told to go around and collect whatever bodies were around. I can't tell you how many, but I know there were a lot of them. So we took them and threw them on the fire. Kind of an eerie thing was when they hit the fire, the air would be blown out of their lungs and their vocal cords would make a noise, so they'd go, And at first the other person thought they were still alive.
Just south of St. Stephen's Hospital, the exhausted survivors of the Royal Rifles of Canada are holding Stanley Village. With them is 19-year-old George MacDonald.
I had no intention of being taken alive, seeing how the Japanese tied their prisoners' hands behind their backs and used them for live bayonet practice. I had buttoned into my shirt pocket one last bullet for myself.
Just after dawn on Christmas morning, George MacDonald and his men in D Company are ordered to drive the Japanese off a strategic height of land overlooking Stanley Village.
In front and slightly above us was a graveyard. I decided we must close quickly or suffer heavy casualties. As soon as my men were spread out on either side of me, I ordered them to fix bayonets and charge. Within seconds, we were upon the enemy in the graveyard, firing our shoulder-slung Bren guns from the hip. A confused and bloody melee of hand-to-hand fighting with bayonets then took place.
This is Stanley Military Cemetery on the southeastern end of Hong Kong Island. By the morning of December 25th, on Christmas Day, basically everyone knew the battle was lost. But around Stanley here, the fighting was quite heavy. The Japanese had in fact taken this hill up here and were controlling the heights overlooking Stanley Village. In really a desperate act, the British general asked the Royal Rifles, D Company, about 120 men, to make a charge and retake this height.
In no more than 2 minutes, we overran the Japanese and cleared the graveyard. We then carried on and pursued the fleeing Japanese survivors to the first line of houses.
The Canadians literally broke through the windows to get into the bungalow and to get at the Japanese. And of course, this bungalow had been fought over for about 24 hours and was full of dead and wounded. And the Canadians, using the bayonet and hand-to-hand fighting, captured this bungalow. The problem then was that the Japanese started to counterattack. And the reality was the Canadians had no reinforcements. There's only about 10 or 12 guys who were left because they've all been shot down in the cemetery. And they had to evacuate and get back to the cemetery for their own safety. They held that line until the mid-afternoon when a staff car showed up and 2 British officers got out and announced that Hong Kong had been surrendered. And the Battle of Hong Kong was now over.
D Company lost 84% of its original force of 120 men in Stanley. 26 men were killed and 75 were wounded. That night, we were informed that the governor of Hong Kong had surrendered.
After 18 days of vicious fighting, the island of Hong Kong is completely controlled by the Japanese Imperial Army. With thousands of Indian, local, and British troops, 1,600 Canadians are taken prisoner by the Japanese. 300 Canadians are already dead.
One of my friends I burned was a person by the name of Bill Fallow. Well, I'm sorry everything had to happen the way it did. But everything's for the best, I guess. Maybe he was lucky. It certainly wasn't very pleasant where we were, so I think probably he was luckier than we were.
Over 1,400 Canadians are shipped to Japan, where for the rest of the war, they will be used as slave labor. Many will die there. In their first battle at Hong Kong, 2,000 young Canadian volunteers were swept up in a disastrous defeat.
The Nippon forces complete the occupation of entire Hong Kong, no longer able to resist the British surrender on Christmas Day, December 25, 1941. Banzai! Banzai! Nippon Banzai! The day of triumphant entry into Hong Kong is here. With the fall of Hong Kong, the foremost base of British imperialism, it means the dawn of a new era, and an era of peace and happiness is here to stay for all of us.
This is the Sai Wan Memorial, and it commemorates more than 2,000 men who died in the defense of Hong Kong or died later in captivity and have no known grave. There are 228 Canadians on this monument, and they're named just over here. There are more than 100 men of the Royal Rifles commemorated on this panel. In fact, 3/4 of the men killed in the Battle of Hong Kong have no known grave. And of course, some of the names you can recognize. This is Bill Fallow, who was murdered at St. Stephen's and then put on that mound of bodies and cremated. The Winnipeg Grenadiers panel has 114 names, and near the top you have John Osborne, VC. He was awarded as VC for Jardine's Lookout. This is the grave of Lieutenant Eric Mitchell of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, and he was killed 20th of December 1941. And the personal inscription here says, brother of Lieutenant W.V. Mitchell, killed in the same action. In their death, they were not divided. Him and his brother were captured by the Japanese on Mount Butler, taken back to an area just in behind us here near Saiwan, and both were then executed. This is the grave of Brigadier John Lawson of Ottawa. He had served in the First World War and remained in the Army in the post-war years. He was the commander of the Canadians when they arrived in Hong Kong, and during the battle, he was the commander of West Brigade. He was killed at Wong Ni Chong Gap on the December 19th, 1941. He was the highest-ranking Canadian to be killed in action during the Second World War. The Battle of Hong Kong was a disaster, but it was only one of several Allied defeats in what was the darkest hour of the war. For the Canadians captured here, their nightmare had only begun. Of the 2,000 enthusiastic Canadians that sailed into Kowloon Harbour, 1 in 3 would never return home.
Daddy, let me stay out late, for tomorrow is our wedding day. Can't the baby kind of celebrate? Oh, kiss the boys goodbye. Daddy, let me wear the mink. What's the difference what the neighbors think? Let the baby linger on the brink. Oh, kiss the boys goodbye.
I had been told by a First World War soldier, never join the service. Don't go overseas. It's not what you think it is. And of course he was right, but who listens? And of course we didn't. And we suffered the consequences.